The first 3 weeks of the eruption here in Hawaii, crazy things would happen in the middle of the night. A new fissure would open up and it would threaten a new neighborhood. Thousands of people were evacuated from their homes. I started the Hawaii Tracker Facebook group to help people understand what's going on and get their questions answered.
Hey, how's it going? We're live. This is Fissure 20.
We had hundreds of people all throughout the neighborhoods sending in videos, articles, and images. We spend a lot of time making sure the accurate information gets out.
This is live. Still lava moving.
They weren't just sharing a story, they were helping their neighbor. If a family was being evacuated, my group would just jump in and help out. So it was huge. They were watching out for each other.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you for the support from everybody.
As we go through this, we're growing closer together as a community. When tragedies like this strike, you really realize how much you need each other.
Hello, everybody. I'm geologist Philip Ong, here with Mr. Dane DuPont from HVERI, the Hawaiian Volcano Education and Resilience Institute. Today is Thursday, May 23rd, 2024. It's been a busy week for us, Dane. How are you doing, man?
Trying not to be burnt out midweek is a challenge this week. We got a lot going on, and we have more going on next week as well. So I'm glad the volcano, though, gave us a little bit of a reprieve and didn't erupt this year while we were trying to do our summit at Kīlauea military camp. That was a little bit busy last year.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's been almost a year since that June 2023 eruption. And what Dane's referring to is we've been doing a resilience hub summit with Vibrant Hawaii, coordinating all of the resilience hubs across Hawaii Island and exercise with civil defense to improve our disaster response, preparedness, and recovery here. So as you guys know, that's our mission. We're a nonprofit, 501c3. And that's the other part of what we do besides volcano education. And just as important that we have good communication channels to share information when it's needed with people, as well as having the information itself. So both those things are super important. So yeah, I hear you. Yeah, it's been busy. Yeah, volcano has been pretty quiet. Over the weekend, earthquakes cycled up and cycled back down again. That's going to be our recap here coming up shortly. And then otherwise, we'll wrap up 2024, which is a centennial from that explosive eruption that occurred 100 years ago. And then we'll wrap back around to 2018, the collapse at the summit, and the first 3.5 weeks of eruption down in Lower Puna, Leilani Estates primarily. So that'll be our agenda for today. Anything you want to add, Dane?
No, I think we go into our update. If anybody has any questions, we're going to be doing it in 2 parts again. Questions for the information that Phil's sharing about the current activity first, and then we'll go back and look at Dawn stock and any questions about that.
Yeah, thanks, Dane, for leading that discussion on the chat there. All right, so let's switch our screen around and get ready for our summary. So our Hawaiian volcano summary this week. Kīlauea's earthquakes cycled up and then back down again over this past weekend. And they've been quiet for most of this past week. You can see this plot for the last month of earthquake rates per day. This is a 3rd cycle this month, and each one has reached similar levels of earthquake counts between 300 and 400 earthquakes per day. But this most recent pulse has been the shortest, lasting only 2 days. The one prior was perhaps twice as long, and the one before that was maybe 3 times as long. So not to say that that means anything for the future, just an interesting note of how the pattern has been decreasing here recently. And that's consistent with these pulses of magma coming into Kīlauea, pressurizing it underground, and then depressurizing by moving into one of these other areas underground, whether it's the Southwest Rift, as we saw back in October and in late January and early February, or down into the Koaʻe fault zone, as we've seen more recently, and abutting against that Upper East Rift connector as well. So that's the whole area, still the same as been impacted. The ground has been uplifting in that area of the South Caldera and the Koaʻe fault zone, which you see here on this map of earthquakes over the last week. Clusters of earthquakes in the South Caldera and in that Upper East Rift connector area right there. Both on the edges of this Koaʻe fault zone triangle, which is the area that's been adjusting the most. Over the last 3 months since the intrusion into the Southwest Rift Zone, areas in the South Caldera, Upper Koaʻe have risen by about 1 foot or 30 centimeters in that time. So the ground certainly is moving. The volcano is filling quite a bit, but it has been able to adjust through those movements of the ground without having to have an eruption, as occurred most recently in September of last year. Looking at our ground tilt at the Sandhill Station, this green line indicates more of a South Caldera area. And over the last few weeks here, you can see that it had a larger increase in tilt before stabilizing and deflating slightly. And over the last week or so has started to rise once again in the South Caldera area. Halemaʻumaʻu, which is proxied by this blue line, has a little bit more subdued pattern, but also more subdued deflation. And we saw inflation beginning at Halemaʻumaʻu earlier in this pattern by a few days, showing that both the Halemaʻumaʻu area and the South Caldera areas are all uplifting and tilting as magma pressurizes beneath them. So similar story to before, there's no expectation of an eruption shortly until the earthquakes pick back up. But as we've seen, that can happen pretty quickly, and it's just a waiting game to see whether the volcano can adjust enough or whether one of these pulses eventually brings enough magma to high pressure quickly enough to actually force an eruption. That's the story on Kīlauea, whereas Maunaloa remains very quiet still, and earthquakes per week were still quite low. And looking at deformation, the spread of the north and southern points of Maunaloa's caldera, you can see here that it continues to expand and move further apart, showing magma is still coming into the system and pushing apart, and also likely indicating some flank motion as Maunaloa also adjusts to Kīlauea's movement. And that's our Hawaiian volcano summary this week. Right. So with that, we'll transition into our hazard summary, looking at our gas. And to start, we'll look at the National Park website here, where everything is in the green as usual. And looking at our charts, everything is in the green for the record here. Still noting that there are some non-transmitting stations due to construction occurring in the park still. Looking at the VOG measurement and prediction project homepage here, and at their VMAP VOG forecast. Here is our emission source. Very low amounts of gas coming out of the volcano right now, for the volcano at least, 60 tons per day, more or less. That is high for an industrial standard, but for the volcano, it's fairly low. And what you're seeing is limited impact to the areas nearby the summit caldera of Kīlauea. So it's still a concern for sensitive individuals and whether you're visiting or residing nearby, but it's not anything unusual per se in that regard. So having covered our hazards, we'll move to our observations. And we'll start this week by looking at a live look-in on a V1 camera, USGS YouTube channel at the summit of Kīlauea and this crusted lava lake, which has been gaining mineral deposits over the last several months here. So today you see some of the light of sunset brightening these areas that are whitish, yellowish, orangish, where all these gases have been escaping around this original central core of crust that was covering the lava lake way back in December 2020 when it was rising within this pit coming upwards. Right, lots of patches of sulfur all around. But what I thought would be interesting is now that we have a chance to catch our breath with this, is I'm going to show you guys going back to after that most recent eruption, which was September of last year, the KW camera from Kīlauea surface. So I'm going to play this as quite fast and it'll just loop. Let me zoom it in here, just so you can see the accumulation of these minerals over time here. So I just picked out an image from about noon every day. There have been a lot of rainy days, so sometimes these images are a little blurry. But overall, you can see this pattern of this yellowish, whitish zone really growing over the last 6 months or so here, right, since September until now. That's something that's hard to see day by day, week by week, but once in a while, it's nice to stop and look back at the whole thing as a whole and speed it way up like this. So now you can see more clearly how much mineral buildup has been occurring around these gas vents over the last 6 months here. And just one extra insight to offer. We peruse the webcams. There is that main image from the KW camera from earlier today. We'll keep scrolling down. Here's our thermal camera, which now has a temperature scale on it, but nothing unusually hot within there. The V1 camera moves around. It gives us a nice zoomed in view, as we just saw in the webcam. In the live stream, we have our Southwest Rift Zone station. Nothing unusual happening there, but as we cycle through the views, here is the V1 camera looking down across the most recent eruption site in September 2023, right through there, which does not even appear to be fuming at this point today. Really interesting how that's quieted down. Next, we'll come down to the V2 camera. We're looking back across that area of greater mineral accumulation is back in here with one spot over here to the side. And I'll come back to this in a second. Let me just finish scrolling across these images here. The K2 camera is the one mounted at Wikahuna, looking over the former USGS HVO building, Jagger Museum. It looks like there's still some building over here. It's not been fully deconstructed yet, although we've heard reports that some of that has begun already at Wikahuna as a park restores that site. And finally, as far as Kīlauea summit views, here is the Maunaloa strip road camera positioned to catch big outputs of gas from Kīlauea as they rise and blow downwind here. So pretty quiet, just regular clouds today, no large plume. But I wanted to come back to one thing over here, this B1 camera, B2 camera, I should say, right here. And from this different view, you might notice that there are quite a few of these darker looking lines through here, sometimes with edges of lava flow, as this one over here looks like it is. But sometimes they appear to actually be full-grown cracks through here. And I noticed there have been cracks through here before, but it did seem like there was an extra crack appearing here, a double one. And so it's been a little while, but I went back to examine where this came from. And so once again, I'm going to go back and play a time lapse. And hold on, let me start off here. We're starting this at the beginning of October. So this is coincident with that first big intrusion into the Southwest Rift. And at this view on October 1st, if you look down here, you see clearly one crack. Second crack is not quite there yet. And so if I play it all the way through from October till now, you see the second crack appears, and then it appears to actually stabilize there. That's kind of hard to see, so let me break it down a little further. Now I'm just going to rock this first phase, and this is basically just October to November of last year, rocking back and forth. And what you might see is this crack wiggling open right there. And you actually can see the edges moving apart. And it's actually bulging, and if you look closely, you actually can see some swelling of the whole crater floor and this whole area more or less in here. And for those of you who maybe are on smaller screens, I'll zoom it in some more to make it more obvious right there in the middle. See that crack wiggling back and forth? Now remember, this is a 1 month time lapse, but just showing that there is movement happening on that crusted crater floor down there, and it's happening coincident with that big intrusion in October into the Southwest Rift. Now for comparison, I've done the same thing for the time since then. And so now we're going to start it at the very end of November of last year and just come all the way through present. And now play it. And the camera does shift once a bit there. But despite that, you can note that this crack is not opening or moving at all any further. So maybe I'll zoom it in once again to make it more obvious. Despite this little side step that it takes, there's no widening, no thickening of that black line in there. So that adjustment was most recently happening back in October, and it has not occurred since, even with this more recent intrusion into the Southwest Rift in January, late January, early February. So it does appear that when magma pulsed in here in October last year, it somehow was able to flush into, to open a path into the Southwest Rift Zone after coming upwards and failing to break through the crust up here. Right? And ever since then, that path to the Southwest Rift seems like it has remained opened to allow further swarms of earthquakes, further pulses of intrusion that culminated in January and February of this year, and is still ongoing, although more recently the magma seems to be building, pushing more the eastern side of the Koaʻe block. So yeah, just one more time, I'll play the rocking version here, since it's pretty fascinating. This is just 6 months ago that this was happening, magma coming in. This is after the eruption. It was over in September, showing that cracking of the ground there. So just a little extra insight as we are considering what the dynamics are on Volcano now. And we'll move on here. Next, we'll look at earthquakes. And first, looking at this last 2 weeks of earthquakes colored by depth. You see a whole bunch of colors across Hawaii Island. The purples and blues are usually deeper. Those ones are usually adjustment and settling of the island when they are scattered across. With this cluster over here of blues being the deep Pahala earthquakes associated with a hotspot, feeder conduits that move to Maunaloa, to Kīlauea, and to Loihi too, although we have not seen any Loihi action in a little while now. So looking past that, you can see that coming into Kīlauea. Let me get it to zoom in to Kīlauea here. For the last 2 weeks, here you see that cluster in the South Caldera, and there's that cluster in the Upper East Rift connector, including a little bit of a dog leg bend right there at the end, showing that it maybe is opening that East Rift pathway, as we've been speculating might happen for a while now. And because that's the boundary of this triangle, as this thing moves, it naturally wants to open up this pathway as well that moves more through here. So still to be determined how quickly that progresses. It does not seem to be going very quickly. And even still, as that happens, it does not immediately put any further risk to people down on the lower East Rift Zone, as most eruptions at Kīlauea's summit and Middle East Rift do not progress further down towards people. So we're still understanding that might happen again someday. But for now, we're just watching the progression as it develops, and there's still a lot more to come before people are at risk. So there is the last 2 weeks. If I click it to 2 days, you see there's hardly anything on there anymore because earthquake rates have slowed down drastically. Yep. Most recently, this orange one is a flank earthquake. And so what you can see here, 3.4 that occurred a couple of days ago, yesterday actually. And this is on the flank of Maunaloa, where it buttresses up against Kīlauea and its movement. So as Kīlauea moves, the whole thing, as it adjusts, however it does internally, there might be some wiggle room for the flank of Maunaloa, this big massive thing, to then adjust as well. And that appears to be happening as well. That's our earthquakes plotted by depth. And we also like to look at them in a more traditional way, plotted by time. So the red ones are the most recent. That's the most recent one. And 1.9 down on the south flank, south of the Pu'o region. But if I instead look at the largest earthquakes over the last week, we have that 3.4 we just mentioned on Maunaloa's flank. We have another higher than 3, that's a 3.2. That's deep underneath Mauna Kea, one of those settling events. We have another 3.2. This one is actually quite shallow. It's showing almost a mile above sea level, but in the sea. So there's a little error there, obviously, but 3.2 coming up just offshore of South Kona. Another adjustment, likely of the flank of Maunaloa there. And then a 3.1 that comes in Kīlauea Caldera, and a 3.0 in that same spot, and another 3.0 in the same spot. So as you can see, the earthquakes in Kīlauea are not the biggest over the last week on a volcano, but have the biggest clustering, even as we have big adjustments all across the island for all different reasons. So those are the earthquakes this week. And with that, we will transition to our monitoring. And to start, I'll show a USGS update from today, which quite succinctly states unrest beneath the summit, South Caldera, and Upper East Rift Zone has waned over recent days. That's it. The rates of seismicity and deformation have decreased, but could increase again at any time. It's a pretty good summary. There's the details about the depths and sizes of the earthquakes, about the ground tilt, but as we've covered some of that here, I will not read the rest of the update for you guys. Nothing else to highlight there. Instead, we'll look at the charts themselves, starting with last week at the tilt. And you can see that over the last 2-3 days here, the tilt has been climbing pretty consistently and gained perhaps 5-6 microradians or so, which is not a massive amount, but it's rising at a decent clip there. And this follows a big deflation-inflation event that appears to have dominated the middle part of the week here. Earthquake counts have not yet increased commensurate with the tilt. Sometimes we see that happen. Sometimes we see the tilt increasing and earthquakes matching that. We're not seeing that quite yet. So that's showing us that for the moment, the pressure is not building up with that tilt rise, and that, as we've stated previously, could change fairly quickly. And over the last week, you can see the peak of earthquakes was on Saturday and Sunday here, and all at the similar depths here for that Koaʻe flank fault zone. Whereas deep Pahala earthquakes, also plotted here, but in blue at the depth, are happening at that same normal, random, sporadic pace. So we've looked at the earthquake map for the last week. There it is again. It's worth pointing out there's a cluster of south flank earthquakes as well happening. And that allows movement outboard of the triangle to occur, right? So that's all connected together. And this area of the south flank is one we've seen moving, fairly typical for that to happen ever since the 2018 eruption. Since before that, that's one of the more active parts with high background rates. But maybe a little bit extra right in here to accommodate the near summit activity. So moving on, there's our cross section. Everything's happening within that volcanic edifice. The deep Pahala earthquakes with a pipeline, we imagine, comes something up like this. There's one possible pathway with other ones joining, perhaps, something like that as well. We're missing a third dimension where you might have some more of those feeders as well. But that's most of the clustering here. And if you look at the south flank earthquakes that are off east of that, right here, they're all quite a bit lower in counts, as you can see here. So looking out at the last month, zooming out a little bit, more clearly you can see that despite these deflation-inflation cycles that have been occurring over the last couple of weeks, the net tilt has risen quite a bit over the last month. The top of this line looks like it's up at perhaps positive 13, call it negative 12 down here, so 25 microradians of increasing ground tilt over the last month. That is certainly a sign of magma accumulating in that Hawaiian area, which this Uwikahuna signal points to. As we pointed out earlier on a sandhill as well, there it is too, right? With Hawaiian kicking in slightly ahead of the South Caldera area, but both active as we currently speak here. There's our 1 month plot, depth versus time. So the most recent pulse was right in here, whereas now we're in this more light background, but relatively speaking, it's way more earthquakes than anywhere else that where you don't have these kind of adjustments happening. So if you're from Montana or Ohio or something like that, then this would not be normal even in our background, but for Kīlauea, this is our normal background here with our current situation. Right, and we've also been tracking on this plot this occurrence of the deeper earthquakes, the intermediately deep ones, that maybe suggest that path from the deeper zone to the shallower zones. It has been flaring up recently in the last month there, and you can see it's still a little bit going on, but it hasn't quite matched what we saw about a month ago. And the reason this is relevant is because we might consider that might be magma coming through the deeper pathways coming up, and then it shakes, it quakes deeper down, comes to the near surface, quakes near surface, and so maybe it's telling us how much pressure is coming up, at least through one part of the system there. And as we summarize, this may be the most useful plot to show the pattern with earthquake counts per day over the last month, these 3 cycles of diminishing periods. And we'll see what comes next. Over the last year, earthquakes per week. And this was our spike not quite a month ago, close to a month ago here. And you can see that we are looking like we're at a lower pace for this coming week here. And we still don't match the intrusion from January, February, even though we have earlier outquaked the counts that we had prior to the September eruption and prior to the June eruption last year. So there it is, in a 5-year context there. Still pretty high earthquakes per month. Kīlauea is still quite active, and you can see that we're still at a fairly high pace compared to March, which was our recovery month on Kīlauea. Looking at the GPS, it's getting a little more interesting here. This is now a 1-year plot, so we have to zoom way over to the right to see what's happening currently. And there's a lot of wiggle in the data back and forth. Last week, I was hesitant to interpret any data here, knowing that there seemed to be some error in some of the plots that we were seeing. But this seems to have settled now. And what it's showing is this is the line north and south across Kīlauea summit that indicates buildup and extension across the Hawaiian area. So it appears that there was quite a rapid extension across Hawaiian perhaps a week and a half ago or so. And that within the last week it has stabilized and perhaps even sagged back, although there's some wiggle happening in here. And maybe there is still some data cleaning to come, but overall, we're on a similar trend as we were before, with a little extra wiggle up and a little extra wiggle down right through there. And we've seen this before, where it's expanded more quickly at Hawaiian and then relaxed more so. And this in the past has corresponded to the timing of magma moving from the summit area into the South Caldera area. And in the past, usually to the southwest rift, but it could also be into the Koaʻe or that Koaʻe bordering the upper east rift as well. So those adjustments are still ongoing there. Down at the rift zone at Pu'o'o, we saw some noise in the data recently as well, but as you can see here, it's averaged out to still continue the trend of contraction across the rift zone. If anything, maybe this rate might be starting to slow a little bit. We'll have to wait to see how this data gets cleaned to ascertain that, but it does seem like it may have been contracting at a slightly faster rate than you see it happening. It's happening here, perhaps. So to look at some clues for what's actually going on here, and especially when it comes to this little wiggle at Kīlauea Summit, I like to look at our 2-year GPS plots from the USGS as well. Just to recap, these have 3 panels. The top panel is an east-west component. The middle one is measuring north and south movement, and the bottom one is measuring the up and down movement. And so these first 4 stations here are the ones surrounding Kīlauea Summit, and they are all moving up, showing increase of ground tilt, right? In the northern areas, these 2 at the top, maybe there's a little bit more wiggle and adjustment and shimmy happening here in the recent days. Right? A little less so Byron's Ledge. But when we move to the southern stations, such as this one at Crater Rim, we see that those rates are actually quite high, and if anything, are still climbing. That's Crater Rim, and this one is the outlet station, which has also been rising quite rapidly here. And here's where you can look at something like, let's look at the plot. This is the big sagging that followed the January intrusion. And we start down here at about 0.1 meters. And we end up here upwards of 0.4 meters. That's 30 centimeters. There is your 1 foot of vertical uplift. Areas like the outlet. And just to the south of there at Ahua on Koaʻe Fall as well. Looking at the southwest rim stations, let's just look at these 2 closer ones, one that's 1.5 miles from the summit and one that's 4 miles from the summit. And you can see that up until quite recently, these stations have also been still rising from October, rising from even from post January, February intrusion to now, right through there. Right, so magma has been working its way into the southwest rift for much of this time, and as it's doing so, it's causing the ground there to continually adjust and still rise. This is 4.5 miles away from the summit. The ground was still rising quite a bit. And if anything, most recently, this last little chunk right in here does not appear to be in the same trend of rising as it was previously. So maybe it's a temporary slowdown there. Maybe it's reached some limit. You can see how that happened before, where it was rising, and then slowed, and then finally the intrusion occurred. So we'll see what this signifies for the progression of activity. But for now, we can just note that the Southwest Rift maybe very recently has stopped being fed that magma to start sagging a little bit. And that might explain why you might have an extra bulging at Hawaiian at the same time as that. So on the south flank, very similar patterns as before. Here is the Ahua station, still rising. And this is the north-south plot. So it's been moving south the whole time. It's sometimes faster, sometimes slower. This is a little bit slower, and then it gets faster, a little slower, and we're back to fast again. So moving fast to the south and fast to the east. So southeast and upwards very quickly. That's built up in the South Caldera area. That's what that means when you see that. So almost all the other stations have a very similar pattern, slightly different details. So I can leave that as it is there. I'll just scroll through some more of these. And what I want to get to is down here in the East Rift, just so you can see that all these stations are still, this bottom panel, all going down at Kanoʻanohamo, down at Kamoamoa, down at Pu'o'o, down at Jacuzzi, down at Jonica. Everything is going down. We've seen some little wiggles where the thing might move north-south a little extra or east-west a little extra as some of these stations get affected by the push from the Koaʻe that's west of it. And we can do this east and west influence. But even as the ground is still continuing to drop in those areas. And just for reference, we'll pull back our 10-year GPS, and you can see some different patterns. Let's look at the focus on the up and down signal. Here's Uekahuna. So this was a pre-2018 GPS height, massive drop down. We've come up quite a bit. You see we're rising very quickly here, perhaps rising more quickly than at any point previously since 2018, but we're not quite recovered the full height that we had before the collapse on the rim of the crater. Like, we're not talking about even anything that fell in, just a sagging part on the edges. Byron's Ledge, you can see, is nowhere near as close to that vertical recovery. At the outlet station, where we're now seeing this most quick extension, also, we're perhaps halfway back to the height we lost. This station's crater rim, gonna ignore it because it's not actually 10 years. It's only showing us a couple years, so we'll move past that. And all the other stations, Ahua, also not all the way up. Puhimau, also not, right? All these stations are showing similar pattern there. What I find interesting, if I can come down to our, let's see, here's our East Rift. Here's the station I'm looking for. Let me find here. Ilinakule, Hilanapali, these ones in here. Just to compare, right? You see Hilanapali further down on the southwest flank did also drop, not nearly as much as in near summit stations in 2018. And its recovery has actually come up quite a bit more. And it's not that far off of where it was. So the further away you get from the summit, the more recovery there has been in the southwest area here. Kipukanene, you can see, has likewise recovered quite a bit. But if you get close enough to the shoreline, like at Ilimakule, then you do not see that. You see 2018 still dominates that signal, right? But what you might be able to see is that in some cases, as in Hilanapali, you have a drop after 2018, some short-term adjustment, and you actually then just recover the original trend. This trend and that trend are pretty similar. They're just offset slightly there. And in comparison, what the Southwest Rift has seen within the last year here has been much more impactful. Look at the scale of change we've seen here, much greater than what you see in 2018. So these are serious adjustments happening in the Southwest Rift and the south flank of the volcano. And that's why I go into this detail, just to try to show some of the differences and how some areas are behaving similarly and others are different, to help educate us as we try to learn about this volcano and its hazards and better prepare ourselves here. So that will be our monitoring segment. And with that, I will transition to Maunaloa. And on Maunaloa, monitoring signals are still, as they have been recently, not very telling. You see the daily variations in tilt in a 1-week plot. Very few earthquakes, mostly shallow during that same time frame. Over the last month, you see perhaps longer term cycles that may have tidal influence, but also effects of the flank of Mauna Loa moving in response to Kīlauea. I'll get back to that here in a few minutes. But also for the whole month, it's been shallow earthquakes, nothing deep happening, which is different than before. Before we had a swarm of deep earthquakes in the middle of last year, or middle later part of last year. So earthquakes per day are still quite low, maximum of 5 over the last month, and over the last week, it's just been 4 within that summit region there. Right. Just although we're noting that that 3.4 occurred yesterday, that's falls outside of this map area. We'll come back to that shortly too. So these are the deep earthquakes that occurred towards the latter part of last year. And in comparison, our counts are still quite low. And in comparison to the buildup to the eruption, we're extremely, extremely low here. So really, this is the true calm after the storm. period of recovery and readjustment, still occurring largely, and now it's downshifted even more from that. All right, so coming to Maunaloa summit plots, their earthquake for the last week, month, and year. See different amounts of dots, right? There's not a whole lot to show unless you really look at the whole year as a whole, and even still, not enough to drown out the features as we saw building up to the eruption. And GPS for the last year, north and south across Mokuaweoville, Maunaloa, Summit, Caldera. It's showing last week we saw this big climb of data right here, and I was suspicious of this, and it looks like it's actually come back. In this case, it's come back down. You still see that pattern of climb. Maybe you see some wiggle coming in through here, but so certainly that the distance is growing, is extending across the Summit Caldera. And if we look at the upward component, however, right through here, with some noise, it actually appears like it's flatter or even decreasing. So if this holds after the data cleans and keeps coming in here, the way you have your summit extend, but the side actually drop down, is by pulling it from the side end, not from pushing it from below and causing it to bulge up. In that case, you expect it to actually rise and spread, not fall and spread. So this is why this is likely a flank adjustment. And that 3.4 earthquake yesterday supports that, as that's the kind of conditions you need to have those kind of earthquakes. So that is Maunaloa, GPS there. And we do have a few more images from a release last week of a GPS campaign currently underway on Maunaloa. There are several pictures included in this. So cycle through these. Up near the rim of the summit crater, over the benchmark, here is a GPS station. Maunaloa Summit Cabin is in the background there. And USGS will come and deploy these stations over the benchmarks once a year for about 2 days or so. Collect all the data and then compare it to what they see the previous year and previous surveys. We've just been looking at some of the GPS stations in Maunaloa that are permanently fixed. Those are the ones transmitting data all the time. That's great. But sometimes you want to have more resolution. You want to be able to zoom in more, and then you kind of fill in these spots in between every year as you can. And that gives you a better picture of how things are changing in detail. So here's another one. You can see they're having helicopter support to deploy these. Another one facing further west. So this is Hualalai over West Kona. And further afield in the background across the channel, this is Haleakala and Maui back in here. For those of you who live on the west side are used to seeing this view. But those of you who may be less familiar don't always get to get a zoomed in view of Maui from Hawaii Island like that. And this is the flank of Kohala down here, channel behind it. Maui back in the background. And so one last one, here you can see all the lineup of all the tripods, all the GPS instruments in their cases. Looks like there's 8 of them that they're deploying during this campaign. So cool to see that. It'd be cool if they put out some results at some point. I always like to see the GPS vector maps, so maybe we'll see one of those at some point. So that is our Maunaloa segment as well. And that concludes our first part of our presentation here before we get into a little bit of our volcano awareness with 1924 and 2018 as well. So Dane, what shall we do for our break here?
Yeah, let's go ahead and say some thank yous. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in today. We rely on viewers like you, not just through donations, but also the likes of subscriptions, on social media. It does help. It helps on the back end with the algorithm. It gets it in front of more people that might be interested in this type of content instead of the hype and clickbaity stuff that dominates the internet. So yeah, if you want to share something real, consider sharing this. Maybe consider making a donation. We do take those on hvari.org/donate. Right there, you can see the link. And we'd also like to thank the County of Hawaii through the Puna Strong and Kīlauea Recovery Grants, as well as Hawaii Community Foundation, for all of their help to get us and maintain this programming, but also all the other stuff that we do over at HVerry. So thank you, everybody. All right. We did have a question, but it's not a question for you, Phil. It's a question for Dano. What's the hand sign for an eruption? There we go. There we go. Thank you, Dano. All right.
Shall we practice?
Oh. You got to do this with two
Did
hands,
I get it?
Yeah.
All right. We'll practice that one there. Eruption.
All right. Thank you, Dano.
Right, thanks, Richard.
And I think that might be all we have in the way of questions. Not a whole lot happening this week, as Philip was going over. And yeah, I think we might be able to move into the next sections, probably. Let me see. Got it. There we go.
Yeah. All right. So let's switch to volcano awareness presentation. And what we will do now is recap a final segment from last week's After Dark in the Park that Don Swanson presented. This was on the centennial 100-year anniversary of the explosive eruption in 1924. So let's transition to Don. This will be 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and continue the story from there. So, all right.
I want to shift gears and talk about the nature of the material that was ejected during the explosions that have been showed. First of all, I'm going to be talking about blocks that are larger, are volleyball size and larger, that behave ballistically like cannonballs. They aren't affected by the wind. There were many large blocks like this. The maximum weight was estimated at 12 tons that just got out of the crater. Both of these rocks have disappeared as the crater continued to widen. But the most famous block of all is still there. And that's the 8-ton block on the landing field that Ben mentioned, what we call the sand spit today. This block broke into several other pieces, smaller pieces, and formed a crater that in dense earlier explosion debris formed during the late 1700s. This photograph was taken in 1924 by Harold Stearns. I took this photograph in 2001. The rocks are still there. The crater is largely filled in by water and wind. The background has changed because there was an eruption that erupted a flow there in 1982, but the fundamentals are still there. So I asked Christina Helliker, Ruth Levin, and Jenda Johnson to put on their best approximations of 1920s flappers costumes and redo the famous photograph that Stearns did. This is a map of the various sizes of the ballistic blocks that were ejected during these explosions. The sizes are from more than 150 centimeters across down to less than 25, and most of them are in the 75 centimeter diameter and larger areas. Here's the 8-ton block. It's way outboard of the other large blocks in the area. This area, incidentally, has been filled in. It's no longer unmapped. And here is a simplified map of that, just showing the larger blocks. Again, the 8-ton block is here. These blocks were ejected out of the crater. Now, this doesn't seem very unusual, but it turns out that studies of Ukinrich Mar in Alaska a few decades ago found that large blocks were ejected farther than smaller blocks. Large ballistics went farther than small ballistics because they have more momentum. So if the large blocks had similar ejection velocities and ejection angles to the small blocks, then the large ones would go farther. That was not the case in 1924. Obviously, the larger ones are clustered closer to the pit. The smaller ones drifted farther out, with the 8-ton block being the exception that might have found a sweet spot between ejection velocity and ejection angle. Now we're going to look at volcanic ash, the fine grain material that some of you who live in Volcano have doubtless experienced. The ash that was erupted during the explosions covered a surprisingly wide area from well north of Hilo, from the Hamakua coast, into Lower Puna, and down at Waihino and South Kona. There was a brief period of time when the cane hauling railroad in Maku'u had to be shut down because the tracks got too slippery from wet ash falling on them. This is a view of the caldera floor with the light-colored ash and the blocks that were thrown out by the larger explosions. And here are paw prints in muddy ash made by Teddy Jagger's dog. So sometimes the ash was obviously quite muddy. Now I've made a map of the ash thickness that was created by the explosions. And this map is in the process of being updated by Kendra Lynn and Drew Downs from HBO. But anyway, the contours show equal thicknesses of ash. 5 centimeters, about 2 inches of ash up here in this northern part of the caldera, and it was reported that fine gravel fell at the volcano house, though we have not been able to find any deposits. The contours are pretty nicely spaced, except here on the southwestern part of the caldera, and that is because this is an area that is terribly windswept, and rain is blown across the area and has rapidly eroded the ash away. The black dots and figures are thicknesses made by Jagger in July of 1924, and his data compare closely with mine, except for this area, where he got more than 20 centimeters of ash, and I get just a bare 1 or 2, if that. Now, Harold Stearns had a really interesting experience with an ash fall. He was in Wood Valley, which is just west of Pahala, and the ash fell about half an hour after the explosion occurred in the summit. The ash cloud that he was in was so thick that he had difficulty seeing a building 45 meters away. And the ash was sharp, and it stung his face and hands when it landed, and it trickled down the creases in his clothing. And I'll get back to this later. In Pahala, W.O. Clark, the sugar plantation geologist, swept the ash from his sidewalk and found that in 24 hours, you got the equivalent of about 400 pounds of ash per acre was falling at that distance. And so Stearns extrapolated that to the entire eruption, estimating something like 2 to 3 tons of ash coated each acre at that distance. There were dramatic changes that took place in the topography at the summit. Not only did Halemaʻamāʻo crater drop down a few hundred meters, but also widened. In this diagram, you can see that it widened, it doubled in diameter from about 500 meters to about 1 kilometer in diameter, and it increased its surface area by 4 times, of course. The deformation of the summit area extended much farther south of the caldera. Here's the caldera, there's Halemaʻamāʻo, and extended farther south so that it was detectable along what we call the Helena Poly Road today in the Koaʻe fault system. This map was put together, was hand-drawn by a surveyor named R.M. Wilson, and it's sort of a classic for its time. One thing the map shows that was not discussed in 1924 is how closely bunched together these contours of equal deformation are just west of Halemaʻamāʻo. I think that indicates that there was some faulting on the caldera wall at that time, much as happened in 2018. Now, in hindsight, of course, this wasn't realized at the time, but in hindsight, the 1924 eruption marked a remarkable turning point in Kīlauea's history in the 20th and 21st centuries. This diagram shows 1924 here. This is the period before 1924, the period after 1924. Before 1924, there was almost continuous lava lake activity in Halemaʻamāʻo. But after 1924, there was no lava lake that formed until 2008. And there were 7 brief eruptions in Halemaʻamāʻo before 1934, but then it was totally quiet until 1952. There were many eruptions along the East Rift Zone, a few in the caldera, a couple on the Southwest Rift Zone, but nothing at all like what had occurred before 1924. Moreover, there was a chemical change as manifested by some isotopes that I won't get into now. also many intrusions during this time. So this was in hindsight, a remarkable change in the nature and behavior of the volcano. And now I would like to end the evening with a non-scientific slide about coincidences that have occurred. The best known coincidence was between the 1924 explosive eruption and the eruption of Mount St. Helens 56 years later. Both eruptions had their most powerful explosions on Sunday, May 18th, and killed a man named Truman. Truman Taylor in 1924 and Harry Truman in 1980. But there's another coincidence that is not nearly as widely recognized, but had much larger national consequences. On May 10th, 1924, J. Edgar Hoover was sworn in as director of the FBI, a position that he held for almost 48 years. And later that day, Kīlauea had its first explosion. I will not editorialize. Now, there are personal coincidences that affect Ben and me as well. The Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of J. Edgar Hoover was written by Beverly Gates, John Lewis Gaddis professor at Yale University. He is Ben's brother, and himself wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of George Kennan. And I was at Mount St. Helens before, during, and after its mighty eruption in 1980, and I knew the man named Truman. And so Ben and I now have come to the end of our evening discussion of 1924 eruption and these totally unpredictable coincidences that it was involved with. And to be sure, truth is indeed stranger than fiction. Thank you very much, and Ben and I appreciate your attention.
All right. So that was Dr. Don Swanson talking about some of the ballistics of 1924 and a couple other things. Any initial comments, Thane?
I mean,
shall I keep going?
The end of it's just kind of funny, you know, the whole, and then the FBI happened to be founded the same day, or you know, basically that just so happened.
I imagine the character of J. Edgar Hoover was a little different then than it is now, as far as our social perception of it, right? But also,
Right.
we're not getting into that.
Yep. No comments.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the remainder of that presentation in 1924. I wanted to continue by talking about a little bit more of where those landfalls occurred. And we showed this map last week of areas that had the larger ballistics here in dark red and slightly less large ones in yellow here. And this is not the ash, but the actual stuff that fell back to the ground as a ballistic here. All right, so there's that. You can see it's a lot further to the southwest, but largely within this Caldera area here. In comparison, I'll pull up this other map, which is also one of Don's, that discusses ashfall from previous explosions of Kīlauea Summit. Now, to compare this, he mentioned that the 24 eruption put ash north of Hilo to Hamakua, so off the map that way, all the way to Puna to Maku'u, where the railroad spun around back in there, and all the way down this way. So you imagine that 24 was probably similar to this pinkish plot here. And where it has got question marks, perhaps they just were able to extend that, actually going to the full extent of the island here. And so going back in time, 1790 was the last major explosion prior to 24. That's this green one. You can see it covered this whole southern part of the island. And you go back, there was one from the late 16th century back through here, and then another one from 1,200 years ago, also in here. So you can see quite often with the trade winds, a lot of this ashfall falls down to the south and southwest. But occasionally, if it gets high enough into the jet stream, then it's going to blow back across the island to the east, and that's how you can get an eastward facing ash fall, right? So that's just telling us about the heights of these plumes. When you see it starting to streak to the east, that means it got up into the jet stream. And 1924 was up 30,000 feet in order to catch that ride back to the east here. So just for comparison, this is an area that has lots of different components. If you're down here in Puna and you have your nice soil, it's a nice mix of all of the organic materials, the leaves and all the vegetation mixed in with ash from Kīlauea that blows off in this direction from time to time. So pretty interesting stuff there. Now to bring this up to 2018, let's transition now, and I will show, first of all, the time lapse of the summit collapse in 2018, because I believe this is one of the best time lapses ever captured. So we'll come back to see the sequence of the crater from the lava lake overflowing in April of 2018 to the initial collapse and big dark ash clouds, to steam clouds, to just seeing the bottom of the crater floor just drop out. And then the edges slump in here at the very last part of the sequence. Pretty amazing footage to see that. And as usual, everyone usually needs to see it more than once. There's a before and an after. So I will pull it back to show it one more time, as it is so impressive to see. And this is taken from the tower of the Jagger Museum. Well, it's not really that. That's the building attached to that, the HBO building at the summit, Volcano building, which is the one being dismantled currently. And there it is, the collapse as seen from the tower on the ground on Kīlauea. But we also have images of this from space. This is animation from radar captures of the summit area, progressing, showing the inner crater of Hawaiian first widening, then slumping in, then having outer cracks form as the whole thing continues to sag down inwards here. So there it is before, the crater opening, consuming the eastern rim. Cracks widen all the way to the western edge. They widen to the mid-central area, and the slumping continues down. So what I want to do here is pull us over to Google Earth. And what I've done here is superimpose Don's map of his ballistics on our current landscape, so you can compare where that was to now. Right? So interestingly, he does note a 1912 rim compared to 24 rim. And now I can show you guys the 2018 rim right through there, right? So transition it back and forth here for you guys. Some of these features, like this flow right here, you can see it's slightly offset because it collapsed in. It's basically rubble, darker colored rubble in this down drop block area. Yeah. So maybe to make it easier, I'll highlight here this collapse area from 2018 as such in pink there. You can see where that is and superimpose it so we can get a view of what's left in here. So if I zoom it in, this whole area is in the pink, except for there's a little cluster of these smaller ballistics right here in the north. So likely there are some of these blocks still left on this rim just to the north in here, not the big ones, but some of the smaller ones just below the cliff here at Wikahuna. So there is the Wikahuna Bluff overlook. And then within this pink area, let's turn the pink off now, because if you look, well, let's look to the south side. Here on the south side, you can see there's a whole area on the southern rim that still has lots of these ballistics all through here, whatever hasn't been covered in this flow from 1982, right through there, including the largest 8-ton block. That one's the one that's over here, that one that found the sweet spot. It's still out there, not even that close to the rim, which shows you how far it got thrown from the pit 100 years ago. So let me pull this off now. And now what I want to show you guys is there are areas on a downdrop block that also have some of these ballistics still preserved. So for example, you can see right in here, this piece of the block right in here has sunk down, but there likely are some ballistics on there as well. Here's what's left that hasn't been carried in the lava. Just to the left of there is that September eruption lava. So right in that little wedge right in there, it might be where you have some ballistics left right through there. Also, if you come down here, there's a little bit of old rock that embays into this flow right here. So if you look right in there, let's see if I can get this off in time, right in there, that little piece of land right here, this one's got some blocks in it still too. But you see that by and large, many of these have fallen in. And if you look at this plot, all the blues and blacks are the large ones. So most of those have fallen in, with the exception of perhaps a few right along the rim right in here, the big one down here, and there's one big one over here as well. If you look closely, there are some like that as well. So a lot less than before. And that's why it's hard to reconstruct some of these previous events at Kīlauea. Because imagine every time there's a collapse, it's consuming all this evidence, just as happened in 2018. If you're coming up here today without any knowledge of 24 events and trying to reconstruct them, you'd have a lot less areas to find this stuff to reconstruct the puzzle and put it back together. So that's a little bit of the 2018 collapse area right there. And just to pay tribute to what was the biggest impact in 2018 in Lower Puna lava flows, I thought we could watch this short 1.5-minute video that shows the first 3.5 weeks of eruption. It begins with those fissures within Leilani, crossing the road, cracking the road. First, a lot of steam, then sulfur, then lava coming out. Fissures opened up. Within that first 3 weeks, you had 23 fissures. The lava coming out was plenty destructive, but it didn't go super far, apart from fissure 8, as you can see here, Ahuela'au, that one put out the longest flow. But overall, it was slower, stickier lava than what was to come later in eruption. I don't know if you can hear that, perhaps not, but this is the booming fissure 17. That uprift part where steam explosions were shooting lava high into the air, slightly downrift where that older, cooler lava that was andesitic in chemistry was flowing out and not quite going anywhere. Fissures then open up further up, all the way through the 23rd fissure as the pool lava flushes down and through, emerges out. At one point in mid-May, just about 6 years ago now, about 8 fissures combine their flows to feed lava down to the south part of the island, just east of Mackenzie State Recreation Area. And the intensity of eruption slowly climbs as that lava continues flushing out the old magma. And this was mostly that first phase of eruption, until at the end of May, Ahuela'au Fissure 8 reactivates, tapping the magma that drained from Hale Ma'uma'u and feeding a massive river of lava that would really change the feel of this eruption for the rest of that summer. Big river of lava that went all the way to the ocean, destroyed a lot more houses, and just wanted to recap that a little bit. We've been talking a lot about 24, we've been talking about 1868. It all frames for us around 2018, which is the reason that we started our work, right? Because of the massive impact of people. By this point, I want to say at least 78 houses have been lost through the first 3.5 weeks or so before Fissure 8 reactivates. And yeah, our whole mission is to improve upon our response, preparedness, and recovery from that eruption. Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, a lot going on there. I think by Fissure 8's time, we were probably up around 200 houses already lost. So it was just really rough to go through this whole thing, from the amount of houses to just seeing like the landscape transformed entirely. So yeah, it was a lot to go through in that whole thing, but without it, we wouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah. I think I was counting the houses up until before this big flow from Fisher 8, which was, I think that one might have taken like over 100 by itself when it first came out. So yeah, we will come back and circle this to this and treat it more fairly in the future. We know that this can be triggering sometimes, even for us, it still can be. But we are still thinking about it, of course, every day, every week here. That's why we do the work we do, and why many of you are on this journey with us still today. So that's our 2018. And unless you have anything else to add here, I'll wrap it up with our couple final things here, Dane. We have...
No, I think, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. We have Volcano Watch this week from the USGS, which this week is the HVO's mission depends on reliable and secure IT solutions. And this is posted online in various places. It's just giving a shout out to all the coders and the internal data processors and curators of the internal systems. Besides just trying to get that data out to the websites and to the public and to other observatories, they're also trying to continually meet the evolving demands of federal regulations regarding security and integrity of systems, right? So basically it needs to be as secure as any other federal facility, and that's tricky. It's got changes probably every month. So there was that. Yeah, that is in fact a little bit of what I did when I first got into HVO. I was processing data with custom software in a backend to produce the first near real-time earthquake maps for USGS, and then the tilt meters are still up from that era, as are the GPS plots, and that's largely why we still have those legacy systems in place there, and why it's harder to get new ones put up online. So that's Volcano Watch this week.
Well, we're talking about this, and old stuff. The new stuff is for us. We just got the Starlinks, and you probably didn't notice that my internet went out already, and it's actually gone out right now. And we were able to deploy the Starlink and get back online, and probably didn't even notice that I was gone.
Yeah, stepping forward. Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When we talk about disasters and resilience, the ability to not get knocked offline as soon as the internet goes out is a big plus.
Yeah, so part of our network building work is making sure we have backup communication systems and protocols and all of that. And so we're getting better. We're still not where we want to be, but we have taken a big step forward with the Starlink. So yeah, nice thing to mention, Dane.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think all I have left is just our community corner, for which there's not a whole lot happening here at the end of May. We'll have more to announce for June programs next week. But for now, there's still construction happening in the national park. It's not that bad because at present, there's not a huge amount of traffic. We're still in the shorter months of visitation from tourism. But that's going to change here pretty soon as June comes around, July and August. It'll be busier, so keep this in mind if you are coming to visit the park. And that is all I've got today, Dane. So transition to any questions or discussion.
I don't think there was any questions. There was a comment from Yvonne about going out to the cones in Koaʻe, or in that the Koaʻe desert there, and seeing more movement, even exposing old Pele's hair from some point previously that had been covered, and trying to figure out the details of that as everything changes. Steady state of change out there. So new things come to the surface, new things get to be able to be seen. Pretty cool.
Yeah, I did point out the Cone Peak GPS and how much it had been moving upwards, but I didn't explicitly point out it's still moving southeast also, right? So no surprise to see those cracks have been open. Maybe a little less so within the actual last several days, but you can see for months this has been happening, and so it's pretty cool to see her documenting that out there. Mahalo, Yvonne, for your sharing that with all of us.
She was going to post some photos taking over time of the same area, the same cracks, show the progress of that they've made. So we'll be looking forward to that.
Yeah, we'll see if we can find those and perhaps share them as well.
That will be made on Hawaii Tracker, those types of posts. So if you're not a member of Hawaii Tracker, the Facebook group, go ahead and search it up. It'd be easy to find.
All right, Dane. Well,
yeah.
If there's nothing else, it's been a long week. We could wrap it up right here.
Yeah, I think it is a good point to wrap it up. We'll have more next week unless something happens. Maybe we don't expect it, but you never know. Stranger things have happened. I mean, we just went through a geomagnetic storm where there was an aurora seen in Hawaii out of Maunaloa. So I'm not putting anything off the table right now.
Oh, they saw it out of Maunaloa? Interesting.
We had photos on Tracker. We had 3 different sets of photos, maybe 4 different sets of people being like, yeah, you could see it. It's faint. You got to do some exposure things, but it's there. You can see it with the naked eye.
Awesome.
Faintly.
I was looking. I guess I missed those in the flood of information there.
Right.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, if you're not on Hawaii Tracker, you probably missed it as well. So come check us out.
All right. Well, thank you, Dane. Thank you, Lou, in the back end. Help with production. Mahalo, Kerry and Dano, for your ASL work. Appreciate you guys whenever we can get you. It was nice to learn a sign for. Let's see if I got it here. Eruption. You got it, Dane? Oh, no, turn your hand around. Bottom one, like this. All right. So now we're all a little bit more educated and better prepared for the next disaster in case we need to describe what's happening non-verbally. So, unless something comes up, we'll be back at our usual time next week, Thursday, 5 p.m. Hawaiian time. Did Dano freeze on us? Looks like he might have frozen on us. Perhaps you're not the only one that was experiencing internet issues tonight.
We're gonna need more Starlinks.
Well, oh, there he's back. Mahalo, Dano. Mahalo, Kerry. Mahalo, Dane and Lou. And all you guys watching us live, all you guys catching us in the replay. Until next week, from HVery, I'm Philip Ong, Dane DuPont. Aloha, everybody.